Okay, so you've all been warned. So today we're going to kind of start a series of different conversations that are all going to be revolved around food preservation. I know that Jenny Starr went over with y'all when I was gone a few weeks ago about harvesting. So now I want to kind of take that a step forward and start to give you all ideas of how you can like really stretch that summer produce, especially now when we're like just absolutely up to our eyeballs in like zucchini, corn, all of that good stuff, all of that stuff that kind of tends to come in really quickly and you can't necessarily use it up. So we're going to just start off talking about some different methods of how you can preserve your produce so that you can use it really year round. So let me find where I've got that hiding really quickly. I can never do this transition smoothly, so it's not starting today that I have developed that skill. Okay, so and I am interested in everybody's feedback on this too, because I am planning on talking about this maybe the next several weeks because there's a lot of different topics to cover. And because, food safety is involved, I just want to make sure that, we're going in depth enough about all of the different methods so that, we are also covering like how can we safely do this so that it's not going to go bad or something after we have used that particular food preservation method. So let me get this bad boy fired up. So part one, there's a lot more methods to preserve food than these 8 methods that we're going to go through over the next couple weeks. However, these are kind of the ones that are the most common, and they're also going to be the most sort of accessible for home gardeners and home cooks. So freezing, I was originally going to do freezing and drying today, but then I got way too into freezing and it was a whole presentation in itself. I just got way too excited. So we're just going to go over freezing today, but also canning, making jams and jellies, drying, which, oven, or if you've got a fancy little food dehydrator, fermentation. And I know that's a really popular thing right now. Curing and smoking is not necessarily we use a lot with produce like fruits and vegetables, but I mean, that is a really traditional method of preserving food, and it can apply to produce from the garden as well. Pickling, of course, tried and true method of preserving our delicious produce from the garden. And that's actually something when we get into it, you don't have to stop at vegetables with pickling. There's a lot of fruits that are really good pickled as well. So we'll get into all of that stuff. And then finally, what we'll talk about is long-term dry storage. And what I mean by that is kind of like your root cellar crops. So like potatoes, winter squash, other things, onions, garlic, things that can last a really long time, just if they're kind of stored in the right conditions. And they're not too hard to create, especially if you've got like a basement or something like that. So just stuff we're going to touch on the next few weeks. But yeah, like I said, first I want to talk about freezing. This is probably the one that I personally have the most experience with. I think it's really great. It's super easy to do. You don't need any like specialty equipment like you do with a lot of the other methods. You don't need any specialty containers. You can just use like a freezer bag. You can use, a freezer safe Tupperware, a lot of good options, stuff that you probably have already. And it also doesn't call for any like really specific ingredients that you don't have on hand already. So that's what I think are some of the really good advantages. And it also works for a wide variety of produce. So I'm mostly going to be discussing vegetables today, or fruits that we use kind of in like a traditional vegetable savory application, which I know we've gotten into that. Like, is it a fruit or is it a vegetable debate? And gone down that rabbit hole several times when we've been hanging out on Fridays. But it can apply to fruits as well. There's especially like berries, peaches, plums. Those are things that people often freeze. When you freeze the fruits, it's going to be less, you're not necessarily going to be freezing them to use like as the whole fruit, like kind of like you can with vegetables. Like if you were to freeze green beans, then if you do it the right way, which is like not hard to do, you're going to be able to pop those out and like serve them as a side dish, kind of like you would just regular green beans fresh from your garden. But with fruit, because it does have a higher water content, it kind of messes with the like the textural integrity of it a little bit, which is not ideal, but it's totally okay if you use it in like a cobbler, in a smoothie, like if you bake a pie with it, if you make jams and jellies with it. It's just not gonna like emerge a whole like delicious strawberry again, like when you put it in there. And that generally can be attributed to the higher water content of fruits versus some of these vegetables. A couple of disadvantages: it can take up a lot of space, which, you know, when you can stuff in a shelf stable way, you have a lot more flexibility where you can store those preserved items. However, if you freeze something, it needs to be in a freezer. So, you know, if you get really into it, you can Walmart, Costco, you can get one of those little chest freezers. We have one that we got at Costco. They're a little harder to find now because people went kind of like amateur prepper hour at the beginning of COVID and bought up a lot of the chest freezers, but they're starting to pop back up again. We got ours a few years ago at Costco, and it's a decent size, especially for two people. And I think it was like $150. So I mean, it's a little bit of investment, but it is nice to have all of that extra freezer space, especially if you are a gardener and you want to be able to, you know, preserve your hard work and not have to run around and, you know, ding dong ditch zucchini on your neighbor's doorstep every year because you have too much of it. The other disadvantage is it doesn't last as long as some other methods. Generally, most things you put in the freezer are going to be good for at least 6 months. And what happens is, as long as that temperature is maintained, it's not so much a safety issue as it is like a flavor and texture issue. So just something to keep in mind too. And then different things are going to last longer when you freeze them, just depending on what it is. But some of, you know, will last a good year or so. So it's a pretty good method, especially considering how easy it is and how you don't really have to do any upfront investment in equipment or supplies. So this is just kind of a how-to freezing 101. A couple of these, I've got a video for blanching. So if you don't know what blanching is, don't worry about it. We're all going to learn together. And a couple other things that I'm going to touch on in later slides. But the gist of it is you want to thoroughly clean your produce. You want to chop it into the desired size and shape. And it's really important when you're freezing that you try to cut them into as like uniform and equal pieces as possible so that they're going to freeze at the same rate. You're going to blanch those vegetables in boiling water. This is generally a step that gets skipped for fruits, which is a big part of why they aren't able to kind of retain their texture as well as vegetables are, because boiled strawberries are not very good. So it's not going to really help us out like freezing sort of that nice snap that you can with the fresh veggies when you freeze them. After you finish that blanching process, you want to dry them really well. Either lay it on, you know, some clean kitchen towels, paper towels. You can toss them in a colander, let them drip dry. And then you're going to lay them flat on a baking sheet. You can get, you know, just a regular one. You can get one of those rimmed baking sheets. I think those are really handy, especially if you're putting them in your freezer, because it might not be like, you know, it might be at kind of a weird angle or something while it's freezing. So that'll help it from kind of spilling all over the place, especially if you have corn or something. You don't want to be spending the next 6 months finding little pieces of corn all over your freezer. So it's a good way to kind of keep everything together. And for most things, you're going to want to freeze them for a minimum of 4 to 6 hours. You can just leave them overnight. If you don't have the space to do a lot at the same time, you can blanch those veggies and keep them in the refrigerator. And then you can kind of do that freezing in batches over a couple days, because they'll stay fine in the refrigerator for a few days while you wait for space to freeze them. So after they're completely frozen, you're going to remove them from the cookie sheet or the baking tray, and you're going to transfer them into food safe and freezer safe storage containers. So freezer bags, or like Ziploc freezer bags, I think are a big go-to for a lot of people. You can do like those reusable kind of Tupperware containers. Some people use the glass containers if you don't like to use plastic. You would just need to be careful with those, because you would never want to take obviously like a frozen glass container from the freezer and pop it like straight in the microwave. So you just kind of got to be careful in that sense. But that is an option if you don't like to use plastic. And the reason that we start off with first freezing it on that baking tray is that's going to prevent it from like clumping together into like a giant ice wad of zucchini or corn. When you really dry it out and you let them freeze separately, then you can toss them in the bags. And then that way, if you have like a really big, like, a gallon bag full of zucchini or bell peppers, they're going to stay separate. So you'll be able to just use half of it instead of having to use all of it at the same time. So here's a hold on. I always forget to enable my sound sharing. Give me just a second, y'all. Will I ever learn, you guys? I just don't know. Okay.
How to blanch vegetables. Blanching is a quick technique for preparing tender, crisp vegetables that uses boiling water and an ice bath, which shocks the vegetables to stop the cooking process. Blanched vegetables are perfect for stir fries, platters, and much more. Prepare a large bowl of ice water, known as the ice bath, a slotted spoon, and a paper or cloth-lined plate. Bring a large pot of water to boil over high heat. Cut your vegetables into uniform pieces for even cooking. Do this right before cooking. Add the vegetables to the pot in small batches so that the water continues to boil. Blanch different vegetables separately, lighter ones first. After about 1 minute, take one piece from the boiling water, dip it into the ice bath, and taste. Repeat every 30 to 60 seconds until it reaches the desired doneness. Shock the vegetables by removing them from the boiling water and plunging them into the ice bath. When cooled, remove the vegetables from the ice bath and drain. Blanching the vegetables is a great way to prepare your vegetables ahead of time, preserve color, and prepare them for freezing.
Thank you, American Heart Association. So if you didn't know how to blanch before, you do now. Let me pull this right back up. Oops. Boop, 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 boop.
How to blanch vegetables.
Okay, thanks for hanging in there, guys. So I thought it was easier to share with you all what things do not freeze well versus what does freeze well, because like I said earlier, it's a pretty good like universal solution. Most things that you grow in your garden are going to freeze pretty well. Some exceptions are going to be delicate leafy greens like lettuce, watercress, like endive, kind of those fancy lettuces that you can grow. Technically, like, spinach would fall in this. But if you want to use it in like a cooking application, so you just want to make like sauteed spinach, you want to add some spinach to your soup or to your pasta, it's going to work great for that. There's just, you're not going to be able to freeze spinach in a way that you can have a nice spinach salad with the product of what you've made. Celery is another one, cucumbers, radishes. The big link here is that high moisture content again. it does weird things to the produce. And it's not that you're going to get like sick or something if you freeze these things and eat them. It's just going to be not very good texturally or possibly taste wise. The like Idaho/Irish potatoes. Again, those are they're a little starchier. They've got a little bit higher water content than maybe like red waxy potatoes or the Yukon Gold potatoes. The exception to this can be like if it's in something. So if you maybe make like a soup, something like that, and you have potatoes as part of the soup, then you can kind of freeze the whole thing and that should be fine. But just kind of on their own, those Irish kind of starchy baking potatoes don't freeze very well. Parsley, other leafy herbs like basil, that's another one, like the leafy greens. If you pop it in the freezer just as is, they're going to get kind of like a little mushy and really wilted, and they're not going to be very appetizing when you get them back out of the freezer. But I would like you to stay tuned for a super fun loophole that I'll show you about preserving herbs in the freezer. Dairy, some spices, salt, and this is in the context of using those as flavoring or additives for the produce that you're preserving. So you want to hold off on adding those things until you are taking those items out of the freezer, preparing them, like then add your salt as you're cooking it. Then add certain spices and herbs. Don't necessarily pre-sauce your things and then put them in a freezer bag. And I know that we do see, like the pre-sauced little, like, you can get like the garlic butter, green beans or whatever from the store. And it's just important to keep in mind that they have access to different things that we don't. And there's going to be, just special preservatives and additives that you need in order to make those particular foods and items stable in the freezer. And kind of the home gardener casual freezer doesn't necessarily have access to that. So I do want to share with you, excuse me, this really neat, and I've heard about this. He's going to preserve these herbs in olive oil. I've also heard of people preserving them in water. This is also something that you can do with like shallots, garlic. You can freeze them in little cubes with either water or oil. And then you can just kind of toss them in your pan at the beginning. And then you've got your olive oil ready to start sauteing other stuff with. Or it can be added, as flavoring, like the herbs to soups and pasta at the end of cooking. So, and I've never watched this guy's videos before. He's got a lot, and he's a cutie pie, and he's got some interesting stuff. So I'll go ahead and roll this footage.
Hey everyone, I'm Mark Sievers, and today I'm going to show you my favorite way of preserving.
You may need to turn it up. It's just quiet, the video.
So, I happen to keep a lot of fresh herbs in the fridge in rotation at all times, but there's a lot of instances where I don't really use the whole package of rosemary or all of the thyme or the entire bunch of parsley in a week. So instead of throwing it out, I like to make olive oil and herb ice cubes to use later on in soups or sautés or any place that you can add olive oil and a fresh herb. So let me show you how I do this. So I need a few different things. I have a small freezer, and so I found these fabulous silicone.
These are cute. I'm probably gonna hop on and buy some on Amazon after this.
So
I'm not gonna lie.
About this is I can stack multiples on top of one another if I have a lot of herbs to freeze, or I can also stack items on top of it in the freezer. So that's one little genius tip that I really can't live without, especially for this project. So it's really simple. So here I have a little bit of fresh parsley, and I'm just gonna give it a rough chop. Parsley and olive oil, this is a great thing to put into soups or stock, something like this. If you're gonna saute onions or vegetables, you could do rosemary, thyme, you can do combinations. And I also find that my cubes hold about a tablespoon of a leafy herb like parsley, and I like to do teaspoons of some of the stronger herbs like thyme and rosemary or sage. Then all I do is top it with a little bit of olive oil, And if there's any air bubbles, just get the little air bubbles out. Pop it. You can make as many of these as you want and as many flavors as you want. Pop the lid on, and then you get wonderful frozen olive oil and herb ice cubes. And because it's silicone, they really do pop right out without any problem. Et voila. How cool are these? Then you can just store them in a freezer bag. You can put them in deli containers. You can add dates to them so you know when you've made them. And you have instant flavor around the clock and regardless of what season. I'm Mark Sievers. Please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and head it over to marksievers.com where you can get more recipes, entertaining ideas.
Pretty clever, Mark Sievers. So I love those little silicone trays that he has. And you can get those. They actually make larger silicone trays like that so that you can freeze bigger portions of things. People use them sometimes to do like leftover soups, but it would also be a great way to be mindful of your portions with veggies, because you can get ones, I think they have them in like 1 cup portions, half cup, and then 2 cup as well. So that would be kind of a neat way to go about freezing some of this stuff as well. So does anybody have any questions, or does anybody ever like had experience freezing some of their own produce that they'd like to share with us? I've done just really simple like green beans, squash. I've done bell peppers before, and it is about as easy as it looks. It's pretty cool. And those lasted, I mean, we ate them faster than I think they could have lasted longer, but I think we had them in our freezer for a solid 6 weeks. And they were pretty good.
Hey, Monica.
Hello.
What I did with strawberries, strawberries are big down here. So I wanted to save some. And what I did is I laid them on a parchment paper on a flat tray, and then froze them for about an hour or two, and then I put them in the Tupperware.
Yeah, because you probably don't need to freeze them like all the way through before you put them in the Tupperware. They just need to be frozen enough that they're not going to stick to each other.
Exactly. So now I can use them in smoothies and all kinds of things. So
yeah,
so that's
my
a
really good example. Thanks for sharing, Aunt Peggy.
Oh, you're so welcome. I like your oyster picture.
Oh, thank you. Oh, yeah, you can see that back there. But yeah, that's a really good example. And with the fruit, there's really not a lot of prep involved either. You can just kind of rinse them off, slice them up, freeze them, and get them in those storage containers. I also like what you said about using parchment paper. So if you're having to maybe use the same tray to freeze a lot of different kinds of fruits and vegetables, you can maybe do like the same thing, and then you can just change the parchment paper instead of having to go through the trouble of washing everything like every time you want to switch. So I think that's a really good idea too. Anybody else have question or comment? All right. That must have mean I did a really thorough job explaining. So good job, Monica. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording. Let's see.